the hell?
I don't know, something's in the room with us.
Oh my god! Okay, it's happening! Everybody stay calm! What's the procedure, everyone? What's the procedure? Stay calm!
For me, Dead Space is one of the staples of the survival horror genre. Even though it's not as old as Alone in the Dark, Resident Evil or Silent Hill, Dead Space has managed to leave a significant mark on the gaming industry, and an even bigger one in the hearts of its fans. Like the aforementioned series, it has gone through its own highs and lows, and even spent 10 years in oblivion between the release of the third game and the remake of the first. I'm going to talk about every game in the series, except for the mobile Dead Space, which, while awesome, is unfortunately no longer available. I also want to give a heads up about spoilers. I won't be diving too deep into the plot, but I will be touching on certain story twists and boss fights. Alright, necromorphs won't dismember themselves, reload your plasma cutters, we're diving in.
Okay, let's run.
Dead Space wastes no time and immediately throws us into its world in a fast-paced cinematic fashion. We play as Isaac Clarke, a silent engineer, jack of all trades, and all-around good guy. After receiving a distress signal from the stranded USG Shimura, a Planet Cracker-class spaceship which is so badass, our protagonist joins a rescue mission to provide aid. His motivation for taking part in this questionable endeavor is further fueled by the fact that his wife Nicole works on the Ishimura. Masterfully crash landing and wrecking their shuttle in the process, the crew barely sets foot on the ship before some of them are immediately devoured by sinister necromorphs. Essentially, pardon the simplification, these are space zombies, fast, aggressive and horribly mutated crew members with razor-sharp claws. I love how the game doesn't waste time building suspense. It immediately makes it clear that this place is deadly and that survival will be a desperate struggle. As we progress, through conversation with allies, audio logs and text files, Dead Space gradually immerses us in its rich lore. We learn about the Church of Unitology, a local religion cult that is an influential and extremely wealthy organization. Its followers worship the Marker, an artifact discovered on Earth but hidden by government. The game is drenched in conspiracies, corporations, the government, the church. Everyone is hiding something. Everyone has a secret agenda. This creates not only the immediate horror of facing monstrous creatures, but also a creeping paranoia that gnaws at the player. Can we trust our allies? And as the game nears its climax, an even more unsettling question arises: can we even trust ourselves? Behind all these intrigues, of course, lurks something far more sinister. An ancient alien force, deeply tied to the necromorphs, the Marker, and the events unfolding on the planet Aegis 7, which the Ishimura came to strip mine. At its core, the gameplay is classic survival horror, enhanced by mechanics that will go on to define the series. This includes the stasis module, which allows you to significantly slow down enemies or objects for a short period of time, and the kinesis module, which lets you pick up and manipulate objects in the environment. Kinesis isn't just useful for grabbing supplies or moving obstacles, it also allows you to hurl objects at enemies, and nothing is more satisfying than impaling a necromorph with its own severed limb. Isaac is no action hero. His movements feel weighty due to the heavy suit he wears, and most of his weapons are easy to imagine as repurposed engineering tools. We have the plasma cutter, which has arguably become the series' signature weapon, the Reaper, a circular saw is handy not just for repairs but also for keeping a horde of necromorphs at bay, and the force gun, which under normal circumstances might have been used for structural reinforcement, here blows enemies' heads off just as effectively as an old-school shotgun. Weapons, the suit, and the stasis and kinesis modules can all be upgraded at workbenches using power nodes, which can be either found throughout the game or purchased for 10,000 credits at the store. If you're like me and tend to hoard resources until the very end, fearing you might run out at the worst possible moment, take my advice. Don't be afraid to experiment. There's plenty of money and power nodes to go around. Besides, you can always sell weapons you don't like along with the excess ammo and medkits. One of the most interesting design choices, which later become a defining combat mechanic for the series, is the strategic dismemberment. To deal maximum damage and take down a necromorph as quickly as possible, you need to shoot off its limbs, legs to slow it down, blade-like arms to prevent it from attacking. This is a stark contrast to what we're used to in other games. That said, aiming can take some getting used to. While aiming with the controller feels relatively smooth, the mouse controls feel stiff and unresponsive. Disabling VSync fixes the issue, but it also drastically reduces mouse sensitivity, making fine adjustments harder. Speaking of Deadspace's unique features, I have to highlight its brilliant HUD design. Honestly, the best I've ever seen in games. The entire user interface is integrated seamlessly into the gameplay. Your health and stasis levels are displayed on Isaac's suit, your ammo count appears directly on your weapon when aiming, and your inventory is projected as a hologram in front of Isaac, without pausing the game. This isn't just a stylish design choice, it also adds tension, since you can't simply pause the game and take your time sorting through medkits and ammo in the middle of a fight. And while the map is frustratingly clunky, the navigation system is pure genius. Pressing the beacon button makes Isaac project a thin guiding line on the floor, leading you in the right direction before fading away after a few seconds. It's simple, elegant, and delivers exactly the information you need and when you need it, without cluttering the screen with waypoints, compasses, or minimap markers. The interface stays clean, free from all the usual HUD distractions that plague modern games. However, Dead Space isn't completely free from the game design trends of its time. Remember how 7th gen console games love throwing turret sections into everything? Well, Dead Space has them too. I wouldn't say they're outright terrible, some players found them frustrating, but they're not completely broken. They just feel unnecessary, as if they were added just because every game had them back then. Combined with the already somewhat clunky aiming, these sections can feel more like a chore, something you power through, relieved that it's finally over, hoping you won't have to do it again. Another overused design choice from that era is the infamous shoot the glowing weak spots mechanic. You'll see these yellow pulsating blobs in a few sections of the game, especially on the final boss. It's a bit disappointing, especially considering how much effort the devs put into making Dead Space stand out with its unique mechanics. These weak spots feel generic, in contrast to the game's otherwise innovative design. That being said, the bosses themselves are fantastic. Huge, grotesque alien monstrosities that evoke both disgust and helplessness. How could a mere engineer possibly defeat something so massive and terrifying? By shooting the glowing weak spots with a plasma cutter, of course. The game also features zero gravity sections. Isaac can't freely float through space, but he can walk on walls and ceilings. To jump between surfaces, you aim to a target spot and press a button, making Isaac push off and fly straight to the new location. Overall, I think this is a solid mechanic, though it feels much smoother in areas where jumping isn't necessary, like ventilation shafts where movement feels more natural. But what didn't disappoint me at all was the game's visual style and sound design. That first moment when you lay eyes on the Ishimura, this massive, techno-gothic cathedral drifting in space, against the backdrop of the ripped open planet Aegis 7, is both haunting and mesmerizing. Beyond the obvious space horror aesthetic, the game is deeply rooted in religious themes. The Ishimura as a cathedral, the marker as a religious symbol. These associations aren't accidental. The deeper you go, the more symbolism starts creeping into the environment. Walls are covered in unitologist writings, strange altars appear, and the info panel starts flashing unsettling symbols. I also love how Isaac's suit fits perfectly within this world. It's my favorite design in the entire series. It has a slightly medieval feel, almost like a knight's armor. At first it looks light and unprotected, like an underlayer, but as you upgrade it, he gains more plating, and by the end of the game he's fully armored, ready to face cosmic gods in the battle. Original Dead Space is a terrifying, atmospheric masterpiece, one of the best survival horror games ever made. Its success spawned an entire franchise, including games, animated films, comics, and novels. Thanks to its strong art direction and tight gameplay, it still holds up incredibly well today, even after getting a full remake in 2023, which we'll talk about later in the video.
Fuck this.
Dead Space Extraction released on the Wii in 2009 and later ported to PlayStation 3 in 2011 serves as a prequel to the first game. The story begins on Aegis 7, right after the discovery of the red marker, and later shifts to the Ishimura, covering the events leading up to the arrival of the Killion, with Isaac on board. The narrative unfolds from the perspective of multiple characters. In the prologue we play as Sam Caldwell, who finds himself at ground zero of the marker's influence. In terms of storytelling, intensity and sheer shock factor, this is arguably the strongest mission in the entire game. The main story then follows a group of survivors, including Nate McNeil, our primary protagonist, a hard-boiled detective trying to maintain order on the colony. He bears a resemblance to another Nathan, Drake, lawful good, handsome, a fan of classic detective one-liners.
Can't believe Cartons did that.
Neither of us is getting any younger.
I'm too old for this shit.
Gabe Weller, a supporting character playable in certain missions. Your typical tough guy who cracks dumb jokes and constantly clashes with others, often at the worst possible moments. Still, he's a decent dude overall.
Would you two stop arguing, for God's sakes?
And Lexine Murdoch and Warren Eckhart. Lexine plays the role of the damsel in distress, always needing the protagonist's protection. To make her more appealing or perhaps to stir teenage hormones, the game leans into her sexuality at times, like when she changes into spacesuit or when she's the only character to wake up from the stasis pod completely naked in the medical bay.
Did you see that? Did you see it? Did you see what? Wow,
Her one truly interesting trait is that she's immune to the marker's influence. Unfortunately, the game never explains why. Eckhart, on the other hand, is a creepy old man. He constantly brags about being a CEC executive and having more access than the other characters. He also doesn't bother hiding his unsettling interest in Lexine, which by the end gets an explanation. Throughout the game we encounter other characters, some familiar from the first Dead Space, some entirely new. Most of them, however, exist just to be killed off, often not even by necromorphs. Take for example the game's version of Leon Kennedy, in the Return to Megavance chapter. The poor guy tries to save Lexine, only to get grabbed by a fleshy tentacle. My first instinct was to shoot the tentacle to save both of them, but I failed this action. Turns out, the correct action was to shoot him, so he'd let Lexine go. Overall, the writing in this game is bizarre. Characters often spout nonsense or react to situations in completely unrealistic ways. The voice acting matches the script. It's overacted, theatrical, and feels like a Disney take on Dead Space.
Thank you for not leaving me. You're not like Weller.
Amen to that.
The story itself is quite interesting. I like that we were given the opportunity to witness the necromorph outbreak on Aegis 7 and experience the chaos and madness that unfolded there. In the first two missions we don't even fight necromorphs, but instead shoot at the deranged colonists. However, I found it a bit odd that they so openly resemble zombies, and in some moments you can even see them eating corpses. Unfortunately, we spent only 3 missions on the colony before moving on to the familiar setting of the Yuji Shimura, where we spent the rest of the game. That's not necessarily a bad thing, it was interesting to see familiar locations from a new perspective, learn the backstory of the barricade in the medical bay, and find out why the EDS cannon was shut off. There are great references to the original game, and while all of this is enjoyable, I still wished for more original content and new locations.
Come out to the coast, we'll get together, have a few laughs.
As you've probably noticed, Dead Space Extraction is a solid action-packed rail shooter, where we methodically dismember necromorphs. We're aided not only by weapons from the original game, but also by a few new ones, including the arc welder, PSAC pistol and rivet gun, a basic tool with unlimited ammo, which can be used in emergency combat situations or to quickly build the barricades using its alternative fire. Just like before, each weapon has an alternative fire mode. Additionally, Extraction features a simple upgrade system. Upgrade modules are scattered throughout the levels and are automatically applied when picked up. Kinesis fits into the gameplay naturally, allowing us to pull ammo, upgrades and logs toward us. The stasis module also returns, proving useful not only for solving simple puzzles, but also in boss fights and for taking a quick breather when overwhelmed by enemies. Even though the game is more of an action game than a horror experience, and I rarely felt any real tension or fear, it still maintains a recognizable Dead Space atmosphere. I really enjoyed the ventilation shaft sequence, which happens shortly after acquiring the flamethrower. I'm not sure if it was deliberately referencing Alien, but I really liked it. The game also features hallucination sequences, which, while not particularly shocking, definitely set the right mood. Unfortunately, the bosses didn't impress me, not so much because of the shoot the glow in weak spots mechanic, but due to their design. They feel bland and uninspired. A perfect example is the spider necromorph. What do spiders even have to do with necromorphs? Not only is it one of the most overused enemy types in video games, but it also makes no sense in the context of Dead Space. In the main campaign, certain missions give you a choice of which path to take. These choices don't dramatically affect the story, as you'll still end up where you need to go, but it's a nice mechanic that encourages replayability. Completing missions also rewards you with new chapters of the Dead Space comic and new challenge mode maps. The comic is quite short, but it has a good voice acting and sound effects. Challenge mode is always a welcome addition in such games. The goal is to earn as many points as possible by shooting waves of monsters as quickly as you can. Occasionally you'll have the chance to gain a new weapon through a roulette system, which is of course based on luck, since not all the weapons are equally effective. In any case, it's a great addition that will especially appeal to fans of the mercenary mode from Resident Evil. Visually, the game is a bit cartoonish, but it has a good animation that allows characters to realistically convey their emotions, uncertainty, fear, and anger. The camera movement of the main character is also fairly realistic, though sometimes I wish he didn't rotate his head so much. There are moments when you literally have seconds to grab supplies. On average, the game has a decent pacing, with tense action moments alternating with interactions between characters. However, once I encountered a small bug when cutscene began before the fight was finished, but it was actually kinda funny.
It's not just today. This all happened after we found that damn marker.
Seriously, you think the marker?
Hey, you went on the colony this past month. Never seen anything like it. What are you, a marker guy?
Despite superficial dialogues and unconvincing voice acting, the game tells an engaging dark prehistory to the first Dead Space, backed by a solid, thrilling rail shooter experience. Dead Space Extraction is a bold, worthwhile spin-off that I will definitely recommend fans of the series not to miss. Oh yes, then there was Ignition in 2010, which is a direct prequel to the Dead Space 2. We take on the role of Franco Delisle, an engineer working on a Sprawl, a mega station in orbit around Saturn. While Frank is fixing door locks and rebooting routers on the station, a necromorph outbreak occurs. From there, the main character and his companion Sarah must survive a series of dangerous situations, with more or less interesting events unfolding in animated comic cutscenes between the actual gameplay. Here I am approaching perhaps the game's biggest problem. The gameplay itself consists of a series of hacking minigames. There are 3 types in total. The first is a slide-scrolling race, where we dodge obstacles, set traps, and must reach the finish line first to win. In the second, we spam various types of viruses to capture bases, a simple reverse tower defense. The last one is a classic puzzle where we use mirrors to direct colored lasers to the corresponding nodes. The problem with the game isn't even in the genre choice, though let's be honest, a puzzle is not the most obvious choice for a survival horror game spin-off. But even puzzles can be interesting. The puzzles in Ignition, however, are boring and repeat themselves over and over throughout the game. Fortunately, the game is quite short and can be completed in a couple of hours, so you won't have to endure the boredom for long, unless of course you're planning to replay it, as the game has branching paths. At times you'll be faced with a choice of which direction to take. Does this change anything in the ending? Not really. And another absurdity with the characters. For instance, in 2 endings, Sarah dies, and Franco is deeply upset about it, even vowing to take revenge on his boss, blaming him for her death. At the same time, in other 2 endings, he kills her himself. Like, why? what was the point of all of this? The game ends right where Dead Space 2 begins. The only thing I truly enjoyed in Ignition was the soundtrack. The music is very atmospheric and fits the Dead Space setting, but it's a shame that the game doesn't deserve it at all.
Critical. Isolating control system.
I have a hard time recommending Ignition to either serious fans or casual players. It's not that the game is broken or of particularly bad quality, it's just painfully mediocre. It's boring and uninteresting to play, and the narrative gap it covers isn't significant enough to make the struggle worthwhile.
You see, that wasn't so hard.
That's what she said.
Now it's time for the good stuff. Dead Space 2 is widely regarded as the best entry in the series. Whether you agree with that or not is up for debate. Some might argue that the first game or its remake is superior, but regardless of which side you're on, you have to admit that the beginning sequence is the craziest, most intense, and terrifying in the entire franchise.
If you can hear me, run! Run!
As you've probably figured out, the events take place on the Sprawl, a colony orbiting Saturn, 3 years after the events of the first game. After digging around in Isaac's brain, the government creates a new marker, which in turn wreaks havoc on the minds of the station's inhabitants, triggering yet another necromorph outbreak. Essentially, we have another Aegis 7 situation, just on a much larger scale. Let's be honest, the story isn't complex. Dead Space 2 doesn't reinvent the wheel, but it's more than enough to keep you engaged. However, attentive players who enjoy reading logs, listening to audio recordings, or closely examining environments won't be disappointed. For instance, in the chapter where we need to repair the solar array, we come across these fantastic logs of Howard Phillips, who slowly descends into madness from isolation while struggling against Auntie, this station version of Shodan, who refuses to let him abandon his post as antenna supervisor. The game is packed with intriguing details that not only enhance immersion, but also provide new perspectives on the main story. One more crucial point about the way the narrative is structured: while preparing this video, I played Dead Space 1 and Dead Space 2 back to back, and my god, how frustrating it was that every single mission or objective in the first game was triggered by some supporting character constantly bossing Isaac around, piling an endless list of tasks onto him.
Oh, go do this, king in the castle.
In Dead Space 2 the narrative flows more naturally, and events unfold in a way that feels more organic. One confrontation seamlessly transitions into another, creating a sense of momentum that carries you through the story. More importantly, Isaac shows actual initiative in overcoming obstacles. He's grown as a character without a doubt. Of course, this is largely thanks to the fact that, after 3 years of experiments and stasis, he's finally learned to speak.
What about you? I'm not running anymore. I know what I have to do.
Beyond the physical and psychological exhaustion, which is the constant toll the marker takes on him, Isaac is also haunted by grief and guilt over Nicole's death. This makes for a powerful character arc that elevates the entire narrative. The supporting cast is just as compelling. Ellie and Stross make for a dynamic duo. Ellie is a strong, resilient character who's forced to team up with Isaac after witnessing her crew get slaughtered. Meanwhile, Stross is mentally unstable Earth-Gov patient, tries to help them to destroy the marker while rapidly losing his grip on reality. Both characters feel alive, with their own histories and struggles, making it genuinely interesting to watch their stories unfold. Dead Space 2 takes familiar survival horror staples like chapels, crypts, and reimagines them through its chilling sci-fi lens. The game masterfully transforms those traditionally gothic spaces into futuristic nightmares. The chapel feels recognizable, but the unitology influence makes its presence unsettling. The crypts become claustrophobic morgues filled with stasis spots. This fresh spin on classic horror environments makes the sprawl feel both disturbingly alien and hauntedly familiar, heightening the tension as you navigate its twisted corridors. Speaking of familiarity, the game has one truly terrifying but absolutely brilliant twist: our return to the Ishimura. Of all the locations in Dead Space 2, this one the one that unsettled me the most. And I won't lie, I experienced a dark, almost masochistic pleasure as I walked through the ship's hellish corridors. Most of its walls and ceilings are now covered with sterile white sheeting, but here and there, traces of blood still linger, grim reminders of the horrific events of the first game. The Ishimura messes with you in the best way possible. It preys on your imagination. Instead of bombarding you with scares, the game makes you fear what lurks just around the corner. Most of the time, nothing actually happens on this level, just the distant noises, the groan of metal, and an overwhelming silence more suffocating than any direct confrontation. Isaac's controls haven't changed dramatically, but they feel noticeably smoother and more responsive. Zero gravity segments have also received a significant upgrade. You now have full 360-degree movement, making exploration more fluid and far less restrictive compared to the original. Open space sections are much larger, giving you plenty of room to maneuver. Fighting off necromorphs, dodging projectiles, or simply soaring through the vacuum at high speed is exhilarating. At times you feel like an Iron Man, blasting through debris field with reckless abandon. Dead Space 2 refines combat from the original. The strategic limb dismemberment remains at the core of the experience, and we get the same iconic arsenal from the first game, including the ever-reliable plasma cutter, which is still the best pruning tool in the galaxy. However, the game introduces a few new weapons, such as the Seeker Rifle and the Javelin Gun, each with its own unique flair. The Javelin Gun is particularly had me grinning at the thought of throwing the Vlad Boker style party.
We could poke here?
Yeah.
The bench upgrade system makes a return, forcing you to carefully consider where to invest your limited power nodes. Necromorph variety has also been significantly expanded. One standout enemy type is the Stalkers, which honestly remind me of terrifying mutated emus. They move in packs, lurking in labyrinth areas, creating some of the most tense encounters in the game. You're never entirely sure where they'll come from. You'll be wiping sweat off your forehead, staring down one corridor, when suddenly BAM! One screeches and barrels into you from the side, sending you flying. Building on the first game's lurkers, Dead Space 2 introduces new child necromorphs. And let me tell you, that's a whole different kind of horror. Sure, they're weak, and few bursts from the pulse rifle can clear an entire pack, but there's something deeply unsettling about children twisted into mindless monsters. I felt genuinely disturbed when they tucked me in that dimly lit school auditorium. It felt wrong in all the best, most terrifying ways. Dead Space doesn't pull punches.
That was scary!
If I have one complaint, is that the game is surprisingly stingy with boss fights. You'll encounter a couple of beefed up necromorphs throughout the campaign, but the final boss, let's just say my fight was over even before I fully registered what was happening. That said, I don't mind it so much because, as I mentioned earlier, I love the flow of the game. The pacing is exceptional, shifting seamlessly between intense combat, eerie exploration, and environmental puzzles. Combat encounters are followed by quieter, suspenseful moments, only to be interrupted by another adrenaline-fueled set piece. This rhythm keeps the experience fresh, preventing fatigue while ensuring that tension never fully dissipates. I highly recommend Dead Space 2 whether you're a newcomer to the series or a long-time fan. If you jumped into the franchise through the remake, then you need to experience this sequel. Trust me, despite its age, it holds up remarkably well. It's a tight, brutal, and unforgettable ride that never overstays its welcome. It's a masterclass in how a sequel can expand and improve upon its predecessor, while staying true to its core identity. Before we move on, there's one thing I just can't ignore: how Electronic Arts released Dead Space 2 on Steam. The game comes bundled with all the weapons and suits from the paid DLC. In theory that sounds great. In practice, it means that all this stuff is available for free at the very first store in the game. Of course, this ruins the experience if you're trying to play the game as the developers intended, unlocking gear gradually as you progress. You can't turn this damn DLC off in the menu, and you can't simply choose not to download it either. The only way to avoid this problem is to dump all that junk into storage and pretend you never saw it. Meanwhile, the PC version is missing the Severe DLC, which tells the story of Gabe Weller and Lexine Murdoch, two survivors from Dead Space Extraction. This DLC was only available on Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, and while it doesn't introduce any new gameplay mechanics, it still contains an important chapter in overall story. Lexine is the only known character completely immune to the marker's influence. EarthGov is hunting her, mysterious oracles attempts to abduct her, and in the end, thanks to Weller's sacrifice, she manages to escape the sprawl. Unfortunately, her story was never revisited. The developers completely dropped the ball on what could have been an interesting narrative thread and instead decided to go back to poor Isaac in Dead Space 3, as if he wasn't fucked up enough already.
I paid my dues! Or don't you think I'm fucked up enough already?
Okay, let's address the elephant in the room right away. The early 2010s were a time where many survival horror fans saw their favorite franchises introduce co-op modes and shift toward a more action-oriented experience. That was the trend back then, alright? The fan base split into two camps. Some embraced the new gameplay direction and enjoyed playing with friends, while others were disappointed by the tonal shift and longed for a more intense single-player horror experience. I remember playing Dead Space 3 back then, and overall I had a pretty good time. For this review I decided to play the game both, solo and in co-op mode, this time as a carver, to compare not only my impressions with my first playthrough, but also how two modes differ. Let's get started. The story picks up several years after the events on the sprawl. Isaac is in no shape, broken, unshaven, and practically reeking of hangover through the screen. Ellie left. Same old story, as she needed a proactive man, someone who could not only put bread on the table, but also put an end to the marker threat and the fanatical unitologist. The problem is that even with the new man in her life, Robert Norton, an Earth Defense Force officer, she still needs Isaac, since our very engineer carries the marker dictionary in his head and is the only one capable of deciphering the records that might reveal how to stop the necromorphs once and for all. Meanwhile, back on Earth, the unitologists launch an all-out war against EarthGov, systematically purging the population in the name of convergence. Leading them is Jacob Danik, a fanatical, ego-driven hipster who not only wants to free all artificially created markers, but also to eliminate the man he considers the ultimate heretic, Isaac Clarke.
Now it's time for you to join the cycle of rebirth.
The game's scale is noticeably bigger than in previous entries, and this is evident even in the story. First, Dead Space 3 significantly expands the series' lore. We learn more about the Brethren Moons, the true nature of the markers, and humanity's history with these sinister artifacts. The prologue even lets us experience a necromorph outbreak from 200 years ago firsthand, and that's pretty damn cool. Second, the game brings the fight against unitologists to the forefront. While we encounter them in previous games, here it escalates into full-blown warfare, shootouts, explosions, ambushes, and all that. The unitologists will be a constant threat throughout the game, forcing you to take them seriously. Danik may not be the most charismatic or compelling villain ever, but he's serviceable enough to keep us entertained with his villainy. Third, there is also love triangle, Isaac, Ellie and Norton. It's a pretty cliché storyline with predictable twists, and at some point it even starts to get annoying, especially once we reach Tau Valantis, where 50% of Isaac's dialogue consists of him screaming, Ellie!
Ellie! Ellie! Ellie! Ellie! Ellie! Ellie! Donkey!
And while I enjoyed the overall story and expanded lore, I wasn't thrilled with how the game connects its events. The characters make huge leaps in logic without any real justification. As soon as they find a scratched up message saying "turn it off", surrounded by familiar marker scribbles, they instantly conclude, "Hey, we found the solution, we need to turn it off." You guys have no idea what you're even talking about.
Are you listening to yourselves? You don't know any more about this bullshit than I do.
And yet, as the story progresses, the characters somehow magically figure out exactly where to go and what to do without much effort. For instance, at one point, they need to find Rosetta's lab in a massive scientific complex abandoned for 200 years, and they just immediately find it, and instantly know what needs to be done.
Damn it. How do we find Rosetta if she's been dead for 200 years?
Wait a minute. There. Rosetta Lab. It's here.
What a twist!
The result is that the story often feels like an amusement park ride, with the characters coasting along predetermined tracks rather than actively uncovering the mystery themselves. Unfortunately, this takes away from what is otherwise a genuinely interesting and engaging story. A story that takes us through many fascinating and atmospheric locations, each with its own unique feel and gameplay mechanics. The game kicks off on Earth, with fast-paced, action-packed sequence. We engage in street shootouts with unitologists, causing chaos and destruction before launching into space after an adrenaline-fueled high-speed train section.
Ah! Shit! Lost the main battery! Isaac, get your ass up here!
Once in space, the game shifts back to the familiar Dead Space survival horror atmosphere. We explore the Terra Nova, a derelict spaceship that has been drifting for centuries, along with a few smaller adjacent vessels. It's hard not to feel the Event Horizon vibes here, much like in the first game. Despite the stale air and dust-covered control panels of the sentient wreck, the place is steeped in the memory of horrors that unfolded long ago, and its dimly lit corridors are still haunted by the necromorph-infested crew. No matter how you feel about the game or its heavier emphasis on action, Dead Space 3's space chapters should leave no horror fan indifferent. The game then takes us to Tau Valantius, a frozen planet where, long ago, an unknown alien race encountered the Marker's influence and managed to prevent conversions at the cost of their entire civilization. Now, among an endless snow and deadly cold, lie the remnants of human research facilities from an expedition that came here to study the Marker. And if you haven't noticed from my The Think review, I'm a huge fan of this kind of setting, especially when combined with blizzards, low visibility and the tense feeling of peering into the snow-covered wasteland, only to get jumped from behind by a necromorph bursting out of snowdrift. I particularly enjoyed reading the logs in these areas. They don't just tell the usual Dead Space horror stories about necromorph encounters, we've grown used to that by now, but also delve into the other terrifying aspects like starvation and cannibalism.
Is that you? Oh god. I smell you! I smell... bread bait!
Finally, the game takes us to the alien underground city, where we get to fight a new type of alien necromorph. While I like the concept, I was a bit disappointed by the execution. The city doesn't really feel like the city, it's just a series of similar looking corridors and arenas, all buffed in exaggeratedly green alien hue. Each location in the city serves only one of two purposes. It's either a combat zone or a puzzle room, or both. By this point, the game overstays its welcome. It has nothing new left to offer and starts feeling tedious. Part of my exhaustion probably came from trying to complete all the side missions, which take place in separate exploration areas. They have no impact on the main story and don't offer much in terms of unique gameplay. Structurally, they're nearly identical, with only minor differences in decoration. One mission might have crates in a corridor, while other has corpses hanging on the walls in that same corridor. They all end the same way. You find a supply crate, fight off a wave of enemies before opening it, collect your loot, and that's it. The loot consists of weapon frames and various parts. The third game removes the store and power nodes. Now, crafting and upgrading weapons require components and blueprints. This actually makes more sense, considering we're stranded in deep space and in ancient alien ruins. The crafting system itself is fairly simple. You take a weapon frame and attach a tool and tool tip to determine how it fires. Heavy frames allow for a secondary lower tool, for an alternative fire mode. Each tool can also have an attachment that adds special effects, like fire damage or automatic reloading. Weapon stats such as damage, reload, clip and speed can be upgraded with circuit schemes. You can also gather resources using those adorable little scavenger bots. I'm not a huge fan of resource grinding, but I couldn't resist interacting with these cute little trash collectors whenever I got the chance.
And just a little bit lonely. But all that is about to change.
Wow. An old scavenger bot. This'll come in handy.
Co-op in Dead Space 3 is added as a separate mode. Unlike Resident Evil 5 or 6, playing solo means you won't have an AI partner. You'll go through the game alone. This is partly because co-op was introduced when the game was already halfway through development, and it really shows. The solo campaign is tightly focused on Isaac, with well-paced storytelling and seamless cutscenes. But in the co-op campaign, Carver's presence feels out of context, especially in the first half of the game. It's as if he was added via a fan-made multiplayer mode. He rarely speaks with Isaac, barely interacts with other characters, and outright disappears from major cutscenes. Things improve on Tau of Atlantis, where Carver gets more dialogue and cutscenes start acknowledging his existence. But even then, the game is still centered around Isaac, and Carver mostly feels like an avatar for the second player, rather than the real co-op protagonist. Co-op exclusive side objectives introduce a unique mechanic. Carver sees hallucinations and environmental details that Isaac's player doesn't. While this is an interesting idea, it's held back by two issues. First, as I mentioned before, side missions in this game aren't particularly engaging. Second, Carver's story, while offering some background, feels shallow compared to Isaac's personal struggles in the main narrative, making these moments feel cheap and forgettable. Co-op also has some technical issues. We couldn't connect to a private session, so we had to create public lobbies and join from there. Luckily, or sadly, there are no public sessions on the servers anymore, so finding your lobby wasn't a problem. Another issue was the in-game voice chat. Even with high-quality microphones, the voice volume was ridiculously low. I had to lower the game's audio to 10% just to hear my co-op partner at all. Still, despite its flaws, I had a blast playing co-op. I know it's not for everyone, especially in survival horror genre, but mowing down necromorphs side by side with a friend is just a pure fun. Yes, the game instantly loses what little horror atmosphere it had left, but its action elements shine in co-op.
My name is Jeff.
During shootouts with unitologists, my friend and I were rolling around the battlefield in hysterical laughter. At one point we decided to complete a side mission entirely while crouching, pretending that it's a Metal Gear. Dead Space 3 is not a perfect game, and I definitely think it's weaker than the first two, but it's still a solid, entertaining experience that deserves attention. No matter how you prefer your horror, alone or with a friend, you'll have a good time. And it's a real shame we never got a proper sequel, especially considering how Awakened ended. Awakened is a lot like Severed, a short, linear run back through familiar locations. While it doesn't offer anything new in terms of gameplay, I enjoyed it for two reasons. First, it's scarier than the base game. Isaac and Carver experience disturbing hallucinations and their sanity visibly crumbles. There's an overwhelming sense of confusion, and the already dark atmosphere takes on an even more nightmarish tone. Second, that ending. The DLC ends on even bigger cliffhanger than the main game. Back in 2013 I was stunned and eagerly waited for a sequel to see how Isaac and Carver would escape their dire situation.
That's it, man. Game over, man. It's game over.
I'll be honest, when Dead Space Remake was announced, I was in skeptical camp. I thought the original still held up perfectly well and didn't need a remake. But New Dead Space took me by surprise in the best way possible. We're back in Isaac Clarke's boots, but right away there are major differences from the original. He has a new face and he talks. The core story remains the same. We're back on the Ishimura and everything goes to hell the moment we step aboard. The main narrative and key events are largely unchanged, and for those who played the 2008 game but haven't revisited it in years, it might even feel like this is exactly how it always was, but that's not entirely true. Small changes are scattered throughout: how events unfold, how characters react, how one moment flows into the next. Locations have been expanded and reworked. The storytelling feels smoother, more natural, less like a checklist of objectives stretched over 12 hours of gameplay. It gives the narrative more depth, more nuance, making it feel richer and more immersive. Characters also feel more fleshed out, with subtle backstories unfolding as you progress. Text logs and audio diaries are now supplemented with holograms. This not only enhances storytelling, but also breathes some eerie life into this dead ship. When you see holographic recordings of a crew member in different parts of the ship, you can't help but start worrying about their fate and how their story intertwines with others. This brings me to one of the remake's biggest strengths. Its environmental storytelling. Every room, every deck, from the mine to the bridge, feels like a place where people lived and worked. Coffee cups are still on desks, a unitology book rests on the captain's chair, and hastily made barricades tell silent stories of desperate survivors trying to hold out. Some areas, like the infamous crew deck, tell grotesque stories through their surroundings. Stories we might be better off not knowing. I also have to mention how masterfully the game uses visuals and sound together. The horrifying imagery sets the tone, yes, but it's the audio that amplifies it tenfold. Even if you removed every necromorph from the game, walking through the Ishimura's corridors will still be terrifying. The groaning metal, the mechanical hums, the sudden crashes in the distance, every sound is tuned to feel hostile, aimed directly at the player. Taken together, all these effects form a single, deranged voice, the voice of the Ishimura itself, arguably the game's greatest antagonist. Gameplay-wise, Dead Space Remake is still the same atmospheric, dread-soaked survival horror at its core. The necromorphs remain terrifying, but now that fear is amplified by a constant sense of unease. That's thanks to Intensity Director, which introduces dynamic events on top of the scripted ones you might already expect if you play it original. Backtracking is no longer safe, enemies can ambush you at any time as the game decides when and where to apply pressure. Inventory full of ammo and medkits, the game might toss a necromorph at you from a vent just to balance it. Feeling too comfortable on the Ishimura, the showers might suddenly turn on with an ear-piercing shriek while you're casually walking past the restroom. The game knows how to keep your heart rate up. One of the notable changes in the remake is that you no longer have to buy weapons. Instead, Isaac finds them naturally while exploring the ship. You don't have to go out of your way either, just follow the story and keep an eye out for unlocked rooms. Early on, I found myself low on plasma cutter ammo, my usual go-to weapon, but had plenty stocked up for others. That encouraged me to experiment, and I'm glad I did. My old favorites, the Reaper and the Force Gun, are even better now. The Reaper is an absolute meat grinder, able to hold back a crowd while turning enemies into a fine necromorph puree. And now there is a less chance of monster wedging itself between you and your saw blade, which used to be an issue in the original. The Force Gun, which fires a powerful kinetic blast, is even more visceral this time around. Every shot strips flesh from enemies, layer by layer, making it one of the most satisfying weapons in the game. And let's talk about the flamethrower. It's vastly improved over the original. So many games struggle to make flamethrowers feel powerful, but here we feel like R.J. MacReady, torching space horrors like it's the thing. Weapon modification has also become more interesting. You can find or purchase special upgrade modules that unlock new nodes, where in addition to the usual upgrades like damage, clip capacity and reload speed, there are also special effects such as applied damage over time to each shot, or melee attacks can knock enemies prone. The monster roster hasn't changed much, we're still being hunted by the same set of necromorphs from the 2008 game, including the old favorite, the Regenerator Hunter, still as unstoppable and deadly as ever. And while I don't think regular enemies needed any changes, I was a bit disappointed that the encounter with the Hive Mind wasn't altered. It's still the same shooting gallery with glowing bumps on the boss. Aside from the final boss, where the developers opted to play it safe, the rest of the remake follows the approach of leaving what already works great as is and improving where there's room for enhancement. For example, they changed the map, but kept the navigation system. Now let's talk about gameplay changes. First, the zero gravity sections. In the remake they've done away with the awkward wall jumping mechanic, and now we can float freely like in Dead Space 2 and 3, with full control over Isaac's movements. Speaking of awkwardness, the asteroid shooting section has been completely overhauled. It's no longer a typical turret section from that era, but rather a sleek, more integrated mechanic that fits naturally into the gameplay. Secondly, side missions have been added. A small and pleasant addition to the main campaign. They break up a linear progression with some well-placed backtracking, give a little more lore about the game's world and the stories of specific characters, and provide additional resources. That brings me to another change. Security clearance has replaced the not locked rooms from the original. Throughout the game you'll find lockers, chests and sometimes doors to rooms locked behind certain level of access. You'll unlock the first levels simply by progressing through the story, but to access higher tier storage, like the third and master levels, you'll need to complete a small side quest. This whole event isn't essential for completing the game and is definitely skippable, but if you want to thoroughly explore the ship and don't want to miss the chance to pick up not just useful resources but also weapon upgrades, I'd recommend keeping an eye on the You're Not Authorized quest. In conclusion, I just want to say that I really enjoyed the 2023 version. It's a faithful remake of the original, made with the goal of honoring the source material while improving it using accumulated experience and technology that wasn't available 15 years ago. For long-time fans of the series, it's an opportunity to relive a beloved game in the form it's preserved in our memories, while for newcomers, it's a chance to discover the terrifying world of Dead Space at its prime.
What a beauty. Biggest planet cracker in her class, you know. And it looks like they already popped the cork.
So here's how the Dead Space series went. Returning to what I said earlier, I truly believe the series consisted more of highs than lows. I had an immense amount of fun replaying it. I don't know what the future holds, whether a remake of second game will happen or if a continuation will ever come. I have no idea what's going on behind the scenes at Electronic Arts, but for me, the most important thing is that the Dead Space series isn't dead. And while we wait for its return, I'm glad there is a chance to go back to the Ishimura, experiencing the outbreak on Sprawl and cool down on Tau Valantis. If by some miracle you found this video and had the patience to watch all the way through, please leave a comment about your favorite parts of Dead Space. What are you hoping for in the future of the series? I'd be happy to chat with you. And as always, this was Radio Nick, still there, still kicking, so if anyone is watching this, hit that subscribe button. I'm not planning to stop, and see you in the next video.
You complete bastard! Was this your great plan? Dump me off and die?
Full of bad ideas, remember?